This second module, we're going to take a look at government and environment again and jump off a little bit from Hardin's idea of tragedy of the commons by taking a look at how we can regulate property in a society to deal with problems related to tragedy of the commons. So we'll call this section the property rights regimes to deal with common pool resources. And there are four quadrants here. First is the idea of open access, which is more or less what we were referring to as the commons. Private property, naturally where people own the property and have the ability to exclude others. State property, where the government owns the property and has the ability to be able to regulate that property in the interest of conservation or environmentalism. And finally, communal property, where a group of individuals is responsible for something, but they can set restrictions on themselves in an effort to be able to achieve sustainability, right? So what we generally know is that the kind of classic conversation about these kind of common pool resources or open access and this tragedy of commons is not conducive to being able to have sustainability. So again, just to rehash, in the absence of kind of these private property rights or somebody owning the property, access to land is free and open to all. As a consequence of that, the individuals wish to be able to maximize their own profits runs counter to the community's need to be able to sustainably maintain that land over the long term, and people overuse or overgraze that land to the point of actually making it no longer usable. So that's kind of the conundrum related to this idea of the tragedy of the commons and of open access. Now, very interestingly, just to parenthetically step back, there is some debate about whether or not this tragedy of the commons has ever been part of human history. So another historian, Susan Buck, came along and essentially made the argument that really this idea that in medieval times there was a commons and everybody just ran all their cattle onto it and killed it off never really was actually the case. And that in many cases what happened was there were pretty strict rules about how often and where on the commons you were allowed to be able to feed your sheep or your cattle. There were certain times of the year that you could go on to those properties, and then you had to move from field to field in order to be able to have sustainable agriculture. And in addition to that, say for example you're growing some sort of wheat, at the end of the growing season you were allowed to take cattle onto that common in order to be able to, they would eat the wheat and leave their droppings for manure that would help fertilize and everything. But the reality was that you didn't have unlimited access to that land. So the medieval practice of stinting was essentially to find out how many cows you thought could possibly be on one piece of land, and then allocate that number of cows to the people that lived in the community. So they had some concept of sustainability even back then, and perhaps this whole Hardin idea of the tragedy of the commons never actually existed to begin with. But the short of it is, it always needs regulation at some point or people are over going to use their assets. Again, we can use some examples as we have here with the kind of medieval commons. The idea of shooting buffalo or bison on the American prairies is another example of that. People hunted that for sport, hunted it for the furs, and weren't really concerned about the nature of killing them off. This kind of open access to the ocean is another area in which the tragedy of commons has really been felt. If you think about it, it is very rational for people to be able to try to take as many, say for example, tuna out of the sea as they possibly can, because if I don't take out that next tuna, you're going to do that. And it's not really rational for me to limit the amount of tuna that I would take out, because if I don't take out more tuna, somebody else is going to. So in essence, whenever you have this open access without regulation, people are going to want to take more than they possibly could in a sustainable environment because it's in their economic self-interest to do so, and if they don't do it, somebody else will, right? So that's the problem with this open access. Now, we've got the second thing, which was, the problem number one for the tragedy of the commons, and the solving part of this is the idea of giving private property to individuals. So an individual or a business has the right to be able to say, this is how much we're going to use this land, this is who can use it, and we can regulate that land on the basis of the fact that we've got a long-term interest in keeping this sustainable because we own this property. And we want to do what's going to make us most money over the long term. So private property creates a sustainability aspect and an incentive for us to create sustainable practices because over the long term we accept the consequences for what happens on our land. But again, then we also have the problem of externalities, as we talked about before, that what I do on my land may well affect your land, whether it's pollution in stream runoff, whether it's air pollution, whatever the case may be. There are instances in which what I do on my land may be sustainable for me, but not sustainable for the community as a whole outside of my private property. The third kind of regime we could take a look at would be the idea of state property. So in this case, what we would have is that the government, we don't usually call the government the state in the United States, but the government would step in and take communal control over certain areas in order to be able to regulate those resources and ensure ecological diversity and ensure that there would not be overuse of that property, right? In this case, there would be public kind of discussion about what should be used on that area, but that again doesn't come without conflict. So for example, you see here in 1872, Yellowstone National Park was founded. Now we go there to see buffalo and wolves and bear and so forth, and that really wasn't all that incredible to people who lived at that time. It was really the geothermal kind of capacity of Yellowstone that set that aside and made it such a unique thing, and it was the reason why it was created as a national park. But that entire area was then created as a way for the government to keep this area pristine over the long term and use it in a sustainable manner, if at all. Now, again, this idea of the state owning the property does take this kind of off limits, but there are always also conflicts associated with that. Because of the fact that there is public input into what government does with its property, at the end of the day, we see many controversies about that. So, for example, here, grizzly populations are protected or have been protected historically within the confines of Yellowstone National Park, but there is no kind of gate that keeps them into the national park. And as a consequence of that, in areas around that, there are controversies within the communities about bear regulation. Snowmobiling within the context of Yellowstone National Park has been controversial over the years in order to maintain a kind of an environment in which the animals would not be scared in the wintertime, in order to be able to maintain an area without pollution, both air pollution and noise pollution. At points in time, snowmobiles have been banned. Well, that's good for the environmentalists, but if you happen to own some sort of kind of property outside of Yellowstone that runs tours within the context of the national park, that makes it much more difficult for you economically. So these kind of clashes constantly happen even on public land. And the question always becomes on this state property, what do we do with it? Do we enter into kind of this idea of conservation of resources and kind of use some of it but use it prudently, or do we leave it pristine? And these arguments are constantly taking place even when the government owns property. And then finally we have the idea of communal property. And this is some ideas that have come along. Eleanor Ostrom, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, has tried to prove that this can work sometimes. Where the government kind of steps in, sets some of the terms of the debate, and then lets people use those resources by arguing with each other and trying to come up with rules, right? So basically something's held in common, and we regulate it by working together and coming up with a solution to keep it sustainable. So that idea of medieval stinting that I mentioned earlier, the idea that we could try to figure out, okay, how many cows could be on the commons in order for us to behave in a sustainable manner. So there might be 20 cows allowed, then we allocate the space for 20 cows among the people in the community. That would be an idea of communal property and communal regulation while still having a common property. One of the ways that this is used, and probably most successfully here in the United States, is in the state of Maine. And Maine has what's called a number of Maine lobster management zones. These were created by the state legislature in the early 1990s. Basically, the state of Maine controls, I think, about 3 miles out, and beyond that, that's federal waters. And the question is, how did they build a sustainable practice of lobstering within the context of Maine politics? And Maine historically has done fairly well at keeping the population of lobster healthy by a number of different regulations, which only people in Maine really care about. Size limits. Interestingly enough, they actually are required by law to throw back larger females, because larger females create more eggs, which actually create a bigger population of lobsters. And the fishermen are willing to do this because they know that that creates a more sustainable system. So what the state legislature did in the mid-1990s was create a number of different Maine lobster management zones. And you can see the kind of cutouts here. I think there are about 10 of them. And within each one of these, there would be a council that was elected by the fishermen that were going to actually fish in that area or lay their lobster pots. And then they would have the ability to be able to create the regulations for sustainable practices within their management zone. And they would deal with the conflicts. And among the things that they dealt with, which the legislature could never do, was they came up with who could actually be the people, how many people were going to be able to lobster in that area, how many lobster traps were you going to be able to set, which is, again, something that the legislature could never come up with. And what they found is that this works very well. And the reason why is that the very people that are setting the limits are the same people that over a long period of time are going to be the ones that are going to continue to lobster there. They know that they're responsible for keeping their areas sustainable so that their business model continues to function for a long time. And here's a great quote, I think, just kind of to take this idea home. There's a little island, very tiny island called Matinicus Island. Gets a ferry service like once every 2 weeks, gets its mail flown in. And the idea here is it's a means of sustainable fishing. It's a means of conserving fish. If you're fishing the same bottom year after year, you're not going to screw it up. You're going to protect your family's future. And that's really the idea here of this communal property, right? Is the idea that we can have commons, but if we agree to set limits together, we can have common property and still be able to find a way to sustainably function on that property for the long term. So those are a couple of the kind of property regimes that we can speak of and the way that we can regulate property in a manner that would, at the end of the day, in most of those cases, create some sort of sustainable system through government regulation.